We begin the Gemara today towards the bottom of Daf Lamed Aleph on Med Aleph in the Mishnah. Zok Heilige Mishnah, Ein mevaken eitzim. You cannot chop wood on Yontif. Lo min hakeiros, not from a pile of or a row of beams that are set up basically to be used for construction, and it's not used for firewood, so it's muktzeh. V'lo min hakeira shenishbara, and not from beams that broke on Yontif. So when Yontif came in, it was not designated to be used for firewood. And also, even those that you are allowed to chop the wood, you can't chop the wood not with a axe, and not with a saw, and not with a sickle, because these are the tools, the utensils that are usually used by a person that professionally does this job of chopping wood. So that's the way it's done during the week. It can be used with a butcher's knife, a cleaver. That's not what's usually used. It's thinner, and it's not made usually to chop wood. So that could be used on Yontif. Okay, now when I read the Mishnah, I already jumped to the maskan of the Gemara, that in the first part of the Mishnah, it's saying that the issue is muktzeh. But in the Havamin of the Gemara, as Rashi explains, the Gemara is thinking that the Mishnah has no issue with muktzeh. The only issue the Mishnah has over here is that chopping wood on Yontif is a mundane weekday activity, and we saw before there are many things that Chachamim were masakin that you shouldn't do on Yontif just because it's uvdin d'chayil, not to be mezalzel in Yontif. So the Gemara in the beginning was thinking that the only reason you shouldn't chop the wood, and that it said, when you have a row of woods and so on, is because it's too much of a tircha and it's similar to a weekday activity. So based on this, the Gemara asks a question. Frag the Gemara, in the beginning of the Mishnah, it says that you shouldn't chop the wood at all. It says if you have these rows of wood, you have other wood that broke, so you shouldn't chop this wood for firewood. So the Gemara understood now that why not? Because it's a tircha. That's why, nothing to do with muktzeh. If so, the question is, how does it say afterwards in the Sefer that you could chop the wood if you're using a kufitz, if you're using a cleaver? The pshat of the Mishnah is different, and it's missing in the words of the Mishnah, and this is what it's saying. You're not allowed to chop wood when you have the woods that are piled up they're piled up in a row in order to be used for construction. So it was designated for that. It's muktzeh. That's the issue the Mishnah is saying. Or a beam from a house that broke on Yontif that was not designated for firewood. You could chop wood from the wood that was already broken from before Yontif. So that wasn't used, it wasn't part of the structure of the house, that was already from before Yontif, designated to be used for firewood. And then the Mishnah says, and when it comes to chop this wood, you shouldn't use a regular axe or a saw or a sickle that's usually used, you should use this butcher's knife. So that's the pshat of the Mishnah. The issue over here is muktzeh. That's the first point of the Mishnah. And then the Mishnah says, even if you are chopping the wood, it shouldn't be done the way it's usually done during the week. Tanya namiyachi, like this pshat we learned in the Beitza as well. You can't chop the wood from this row of wood that's piled up for construction, or it was from a house. Because it's not prepared, it's muktzeh. So the Beitza clearly spells out that the issue is muktzeh. Just before we go right in the Gemara, the Rishonim ask a very basic question on this Gemara. One of the things that we learned before in the Gemara was that machshirei eichel nefesh, when you're coming to prepare something that's not malacha in the eichel nefesh itself, you're not allowed to do that on Yontif if it could have been prepared before Yontif. So these woods, chopping wood, the chayre is something that could have been prepared from before Yontif. So how are you allowed to do this on Yontif? So the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch brings the teretz that over here we're speaking about chopping wood not into very small pieces. When you chop wood into very small pieces, it's a malacha min hatayra, I guess a teilda of teichen. That would take be asked to do on Yontif because it could have been done before Yontif. Here we're talking about chopping pieces of wood into larger pieces, which is only an ism d'Rabbanan. So because it's only ism d'Rabbanan, if it's done with a shinui, Chacham allowed it to be done even on Yontif. The loy bekardum, so the Mishnah said you shouldn't use a axe. Lo shanu ela benakfas shaloi. So the axe has two sides to it. There's a narrow side and there's a wider edge. So the wider edge of this axe, which is what's usually used by the people that usually are chopping wood, and those professionals that chop wood, that's something that shouldn't be done that way on Yontif. Aval bezachris shaloi. But on the narrower edge of this axe, mutter, that's allowed, because that's not the side that's usually used. Fragt Gemara, pshita, this distinction should be obvious, because bekufitz tnan, it basically says the same point in the Mishnah, that you could use a kufitz, this butcher's knife, because the butcher's knife is more narrow and it's not usually used to chop the wood. So therefore, same thing should be when it comes to the narrow edge of the axe. So the Gemara says, no, there's a chiddush here, because ma'al de teime, I would think, haramili kufitz l'chudei. I would think only when it comes to this butcher's knife, which is narrow, has a narrow edge on all sides, and therefore that's allowed. Avol kardim v'kufitz, but when you take the axe, which on one side it has a wider edge, and the other side it's like a kufitz. So maybe I should say migu dahai gisa sahai gisa nami yasar. Since you're not allowed to use the wider edge of it, which is the way it's usually used during the week, so maybe the other side, even though it's similar to a kufitz, it also shouldn't be allowed to be used. So you shouldn't confuse the two. Kamash Malon, that was the chiddush that he said in the name of Rav, that if you're using the narrower edge, you're allowed. Others learned this statement regarding the seifa of the Mishnah. What did it say? Elo bekufitz, that you're allowed to use the butcher's knife to cut the wood. So on this, you're only allowed to use the narrower edge of this butcher's knife, but the wider edge of it is aser. Rashi explains that there's no machlokes here between these two versions of what he said in the name of Rav, but it's pashat a difference in different places. There were some places that the axes had two sides, a narrow side and a wider side, and in those places, the butcher's knife was the same narrow on both sides. And then here, in the second version, it's the reverse, that the butcher's knife had a narrow edge and a wider edge. And as we'll see, when you get to the axe, it was wide on both sides. So it's pashat, as far as these utensils are concerned, in different places, they made them in different ways. So in this version, he's saying that when you're using the butcher's knife, you could only use it in the narrow edge and not in the wider edge. Pshita, again, the Gemara says that this should be obvious, because v'loi bekardim tnan, you're not allowed to use an axe, and the reason you're not allowed to use an axe is because it's wider, and that's what's usually used to chop the wood by people that usually do this. So therefore, when you have this butcher's knife and there's a wider edge similar to an axe, isn't it the exact same as an axe? So the Gemara again answers, ma'ad I would think to say, hanimili kardim. Only an axe, and here in this version we're talking about an axe that is wide, has a wide edge on both sides. Avol kufitz v'kardim, but if you're talking about a knife, a butcher's knife, that's on one side narrow, and on one side it's like an axe which is wide. Here maybe I should say migu dahai gisa shari, if I could use it on the narrower side, hai gisa nami shari. Maybe on the other side it's also allowed, because you're not doing it, you're using a utensil that's not usually used. It's not that axe. Since on one side it's narrow, so therefore it's not that same axe that you usually use, so maybe it should all be allowed. Kamash Malon, that was his chiddush, that if you're using that wider edge that's similar to an axe on that side, it's also not allowed. Zok Mishnah, Bayis Shuhu Male Peiris. You have a house, or a room maybe, that's full of fruits. It's full of food, but this room is closed off, it's locked, and it's closed and you can't get into it. V'nivchas. But then one of the bricks of this wall was opened up, broken open. It happened on its own. Rashi says on its own, it broke open. Noitel mimokim apchas. You're allowed to take the food out of this room from that place where it opened up. Now the chiddush over here is, even though when the time Yontif came in, this food wasn't accessible. If so, in your mind, l'chayda wasn't designated to be used for Yontif, so it should be muktzeh. So Rashi explains over here that based on the Gemara soon, we'll see that we're talking about a room that was closed off in such a way that to make a hole, to open up, to go inside of it, it would only require to do an Issa Midrabanan. It wasn't a room that was fully closed off that you would mamish have to demolish it and do a Issa of Seisa Midairaisa. You would only have to do a Issa Midrabanan. So Rashi says a very interesting and fundamental point regarding Muktzeh. Usually we know by Muktzeh that if something is Muktzeh when Shabbos enters by Bein HaShmashis, it's Muktzeh the whole Shabbos. Rashi says, though, if something is separated from you and you can't access it, but it's only a isma d'Rabbanan that you have to do to get to it, so that will not become separated from you from the entire Shabbos. If on Shabbos it becomes accessible, it's going to be allowed to use. That's what the Mishnah is saying here. Rav Meir says, in this room that was closed and the fruits were inside, you lechatchila are allowed to go and open it up and take out a brick of the wall in order to get in to get your fruits. Frag the Gemara, but Amai, how could Rav Meir say that even lechatchila you can go ahead and break open the wall to get the food inside? Kasasa Allah. He's demolishing a structure. This is the malach of Seiser. How is this allowed to be done on Shabbos or Yontif? What we're speaking about over here is bricks that are stacked on one another, but there's no cement between them. These bricks are not properly built, b'chlal. There's just a stack of bricks, and you would have to just remove one brick in order to get in. Fragt the Gemara, Eini, is this true? But Rav Nachman said, Hani livni de eyater mi binyana. If you have these leftover bricks from a building project that you were building, shari l'toltilnu b'Shabbos, you're allowed to move them on Shabbos. It's not muktzah. Because these leftover bricks, what do you do with it? It could be used like a chair to sit on it. So therefore, it's not muktzah. However, sharginu, once you stack them up in on one on another, like in a row, then vade yaktsinu. So that means you definitely made it muktzah. You designated it to be used for a building for something and not to sit on it. So if so, how could you break open these bricks over here, even if they don't have cement between them, but there's still an issue of muktzeh? Rab Zeire says, B'yomtiv amru. In our Mishnah, we're speaking about Yontiv, avaloi b'Shabbos. But on Shabbos, you would be right, there would be an issue of muktzeh. Right, so on Yontif, they didn't ask this, as Rashi says, because this is only an ism d'Rabbanan of muktzeh, so that's where your food is. Your food is stuck inside this room, so they were mater to do this isser of muktzeh to be able to get your food. According to Rav Meir, l'chatchila you're allowed to get your food. So the Gemara brings a brayse, Tanya nami hachi Rav Meir oima af peiches l'chatchila v'noitel b'yom tif amru avalei b'Shabbos. The opinion of Rav Meir that you can open up and take out a brick to go inside, this was only said on Yontif and not on Shabbos, since it's ism d'Rabbanan, so they allowed it for oichel nefesh, specifically on Yontif. Amar Shmuel said, Chaysamais shebekarka. When you have these ropes that are tied to the ground. Rashi says, let's say sometimes you have a door of a pit or a door of a cave and you want to fasten it to the ground, so it's tied, these ropes are tied to the ground. Matir, you're allowed to untie the knot of these ropes on Shabbos and on Yontif, and the reason is because it's not a kesher shel kayama. It's always made to tie and untie, to open this door, to close this door, so it's not a kesher shel kayama. Avol, loy mafkia v'loy chaytich. You can't unravel this rope. You're going to cut it and unravel it. For either unravel it or cut it. That's not allowed on Shabbos because that's seiser. That's seiser or mechatich. You can't cut on Shabbos. That's mamash malacha d'oraisa. Shebekalim. If you have these ropes that tie up a box closed, mater umafkia v'chaytich. You're allowed to untie it. You're allowed to unravel it. You're allowed to cut it. And the reason is because echad Shabbos ve'echad Yomtiv, whether this is on Shabbos, whether this is on Yontif, because when it comes to Kalim, the Tana of this Braisa holds, ain't stira b'Kalim. We had before many times. There's no binyan or stira when it comes to Kalim. Only it's something which is built into the ground, mechubal karka. So this is the statement of Shmuel. So this Gemara asks, Meisvei, in a Braisa we learned differently. Chaysama is shebekarka. These ropes that are tied to the ground, b'Shabbos, so on Shabbos, matir, you're allowed to untie it. Avoloi mafkia v'loi chaytich. You're not allowed to unravel it, and you're not allowed to cut it. Okay, but then it says, b'yomtiv, on Yontiv, matir umafkia v'chaytich. That on Yontiv you're allowed to untie it, you're allowed to unravel it, and you're allowed to cut it. So you see that on Yontiv you're allowed to do everything. Right? He said before that even on Yontif, you're only allowed to untie it, but you're not allowed to unravel it or cut it. Over here in the Braisa, though, it says that on Yontif, you're allowed to do everything. So the Gemara answers, Halmani Rab Meiri. This is following the opinion of Rab Meir. The Amar Af Peiches Lechatchile V'Noitel. That you're allowed to Lechatchile go ahead. Over here in the Mishnah, Rab Meir said, when you get to these rows of bricks that was closing up this room and it was not closed up completely with cement, so Rab Meir held l'chatchila you're allowed to take out a brick in order to get into the room. So over here as well, Rab Meir holds that you're allowed to open this up on Shabbos, and it's not considered to be a malacha min ha-Torah. Because it's not asam min ha-Torah, the mafkiya and the chaytach is not a malacha min ha-Torah, so therefore Rab Meir holds you're allowed. Upligi Rabbanan aleh, and the Rabbanan argue on him. And Va'ana the Amri Rabbanan. And Shmuel says, and I follow the opinion of the Rabbanan. Fragt the Gemara, Omi pligi Rabbanan aleh b'chaysama shebekarka. But is it actually true that the Rabbanan argue on Rab Meir regarding this case of having the ropes that are tied to the ground? Yeah, and the Mishnah Taket, the Rabbanan argue with Rab Meir, and they hold that you're not allowed to break open the room. But over here, in this case, do they argue? But Vatanya, we clearly learned in the Beitza, Maidim chachamim l'Rab Meir b'chaysam shebekarka shebeshabes matir avaloi mafkiya avaloi chaytach. They agreed to Rab Meir when it comes to these ropes that are fastened to the ground, that on Shabbos you could untie it, but you can't unravel it or you can't cut it. And b'yantiv matir umafkiya v'chaytach. And on Yantiv you are allowed to unravel it, you are allowed to untie it even on Yantif. So the reason is over here because this is there's no stirim midayraisa. It's only a isim midrabanan. You're not really demolishing properly a building over here. It's just these ropes that you're untying. So it's considered to be only a seisa, which is midrabanan, and therefore Shabbos midrabanan it's also. But on Yantif for Simchas Yantif for the Eichel Nevesh they allowed it. It's mutter. Right? So therefore you see over here that the Rabbanan agreed over here in this case that it's not allowed. It's not clear in the Gemara though, what's the difference between the bricks that Rabbanan argue with Rab Meir and they say you're not allowed to open up the room to go in. Even over there it's also only a Ism de Rabbanan, but nevertheless they hold that Ism de Rabbanan applies in Yantif. And over here, by cutting or unraveling these ropes are also only a Ism de Rabbanan. Over here for some reason the Rabbanan they agreed to Rab Meir. What's the difference? The Gemara doesn't say. So some Mefarshim say the difference is that in the Mishnah, when you have to break open a wall, so there's a Seisim with Rabbanan and there's also an issue of Muktzah. So there's two problems with Rabbanan. Whereas over here, by the Seisir of these ropes, there's no issue of Muktzah. So it's less of an Ism with Rabbanan. So over here, the Rabbanan are made to Rab Meir. That Matir, Mafkiya, V'chaytach. So the Gemara, who the Omar ki haytan Shmuel that said before that even on Yontif you're not allowed to unravel it, you're not allowed to cut it. So he's following the following Beitza. There's another Beitza that says like him. Ki haytan, the Tanya said in the Beitza, chaysam shebekarka. These ropes that are tied to the ground, matter, you could untie them. Avaloi mafkiya avaloi chaytach, you can't unravel it and you can't cut it. Echad Shabbos, vechad Yontif, whether it's Shabbos or Yontif. V'shebekeli. But those ropes that are tying a box closed, Shabbos matir. On Shabbos you're allowed to untie it. Avaloi mafkiya v'loi chaytach. You can't unravel it or cut it. And b'yamtiv matir mafkiya v'chaytach. On Yamtiv you can be matir it and you can be mafkiya. You can chaytach. You can do whatever you want. So over here in the beginning of this Beitza, it said exactly like Shmuel said. In the beginning of the Beitza, it said that on Yamtiv you're only allowed to untie it, but you're not allowed to unravel it or cut it. And right, Echad Shabbos v'Echad Yantif, like Shmuel said. So therefore, he has a Beitza that says like his opinion. So it's a machlokes. It's two different Tanoim here. But the Gemara asks, you quoted this Beitza. If you look what it says in the Sefer of this Beitza, this Sefer of this Beitza says different than Shmuel. Sagt the Gemara, Teratzta locha Reisha. You brought a source for what Shmuel said from the Reisha of the Mishnah. El Sefer Kashya, but now the Sefer is going to be a question. Because what does it say in the Sefer? Shmuel said before, when it comes to Kalim, so even on Shabbos, you're allowed to untie it, unravel it, you can do whatever you want. What does it say in this Beitza regarding Kalim? Regarding Kalim over here it says, Mater avaloi mafkiya avaloi chaytach. So in this Beitza, in the Sefer, regarding Kalim, we have a question on Shmuel. Again, Shmuel are allowed by Kalim everything. No problem to untie, unravel, do whatever you want. And in this Beitza, it's saying even by Kalim, you're only allowed to untie it, but you're not allowed to unravel it or cut it. So we have a question from the Sefer on Shmuel. So the Gemara says, Hamani Rab Nechemyehi. The Sefer of this Beitza follows Rab Nechemye's opinion. The Amar, Rab Nechemye said, Kol HaKelim Eini Tolin Ela Derech Tashmishan. B'chlal, Rabbi Nechemya had a very, very stringent view b'negei to muktzeh, even more than Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Nechemya held even a keli, a real keli, a spoon, a garment, you're not allowed to move it unless you're moving it for what it's designated for, its designated purpose. Ela derech tashmishan. So what's the Pshat the Gemara saying here? If you're going to go and untie a rope, how are you going to untie a rope? You're taking a knife to untie it, to cut it. Not untie, sorry. If you're untying it, you're doing it by hand. But if you're unraveling the rope or you're cutting the rope, you have to do it with a knife. So if you're doing it with a knife, according to Rabbi Nechemya, that's not what a knife is intended for. So you can't unravel it. You can't cut it with a knife. That's why this Beitza was saying that you can't cut it or unravel it. Fragt the Gemara, if this Beitza is Rabbi Nechemya, my area is Shabbos. So why is this an issue only on Shabbos? Afila Yom Tov Nami. This should be a problem on Yom Tov as well. Right? In the Beitza it said that on Shabbos you can't cut it or unravel it. On Yom Tov it's all allowed. But if it's according to Rabbi Nechemya, there should be no distinction between Shabbos and Yom Tov. If you'll argue and say, Shan Yelele Rabbi Nechemya, ben Shvus Shabbos or Shvus Yom Tov, maybe according to Rabbi Nechemya there is a difference. Maybe Rabbi Nechemya, his stringent view of Muktzeh is only regarding Shabbos and not regarding Yom Tov. We had before a few times, the Gemara says that the Isurim Midrabanan, bringing to Yom Tov, is not as stringent as Shabbos. So the Gemara says, but that's not true. Umi Shan Yelele, is there a difference, according to Rabbi Nechemya, between Shabbos and Yom Tov? Vatani Chod, we learned in one Beitza, Masikin, Bekelim. In one Beitza it says this is all talking about Yom Tov, that you're allowed to use kelim that are full kelim of wood, and you want to use them now for a firewood. So you're allowed to use them for firewood on Yom Tov, even though it was not designated for that. It was a keli. And the aim Masikin b'shivrei kelim. So again, let me say that over again. The kelim are not muktzah. We're talking about kelim that when Yom Tov came in, because they're kelim, so therefore you were allowed to move them. They're not muktzah. So therefore, because they were not muktzah, masikim bekelim, you're allowed to use them for firewood. They masikim b'shivrei kelim. You can't use wood of something that broke on Yom Tov. So therefore, when Yom Tov came in, it wasn't designated to be used for this firewood, and they broke now on Yom Tov, and now once they broke on Yom Tov, it's muktzah. You're not allowed to touch it. So it wasn't fit for firewood from yesterday. So you're not allowed to use that for firewood. That's one Beitza. The Tanya Yidach, and another Beitza it says, Masikin, bein bekelim, bein b'shivrei kelim. There's no issue of muktzah. You can use for firewood, whether it's kelim, whether it's shivrei kelim that broke on Yom Tov itself. Either way, you're allowed to use it for firewood. And the Tanya Yidach, and then we learned in a third Beitza regarding what you're allowed to use for firewood on Yom Tov. Ein masikin, loy bekelim, v'loy b'shivrei kelim. You can't use any of this for firewood. Not kelim and not shivrei kelim. Now, how do we answer these three Beitzas? Oh, Mishani. And the answer was given. Loy kashya, there's no question here. Ha Rabbi Yehuda. The first Beitza is Rabbi Yehuda that holds that there's an issue of muktzeh. But Rabbi Yehuda holds the issue of muktzeh is only something that before Yom Tov, it was a keli, and then it breaks on Yom Tov, so now it becomes muktzeh. So that's something that you can't use if it broke on Yom Tov. But a keli, even though it's not really intended for firewood, but because it was a keli that you were allowed to move, so you can use it for something that's not even for its intended use. That's the first Beitza. Rab Shimon, the second Beitza that says that there's no muktzeh, and even kelim that break on Yom Tov you can use for firewood. That's Rab Shimon. And Rab Nechemya, the third Beitza says that kelim, even though it wasn't muktzeh l'chayre, you can move it around, but only for its use, only for what that keli is made for. You can't use it for firewood. So you see over here clearly that Rab Nechemya said his chumrah even on Yom Tov, so you can't make a distinction between Shabbos and Yom Tov. So the Gemara answers today Tanoi v'alib Rab Nechemya. There are two different opinions over here according to Rab Nechemya. And according to one opinion, Rab Nechemya does distinguish between Shabbos and Yom Tov, and therefore we could explain the Beitza before that makes a distinction between Shabbos and Yom Tov regarding cutting or unraveling the ropes that are tied to the kelim. That goes according to Rab Nechemya's opinion. Sagt der Heilige Mishnah, ein poichasin es aneir. You're not allowed to create a lamp. So you take a piece of clay, and with a fist, you create a receptacle of this clay in order to make a lamp in it. You're not allowed to do that on Yom Tov. Mipnei shoyis a keli. You're forming a keli on Yom Tov, and that's not allowed. And ve'ein oisim p'chomim b'Yom Tov. You can't make charcoal on Yom Tov. We'll see later from the Gemara that in those times they did not use charcoal for cooking. Charcoal was used by a goldsmith, by a silversmith, but not for cooking. It's also, Rashi says, the issue of charcoal is also you're making a keli. It's going to be used for whatever work you need. And you also can't take a wick. They have one long wick and you want to cut it into two. You're also making a keli with this. You're not allowed to do it on Yantif. Rav Yudah says, you can't cut it by hand or with a utensil, but if you cut it by burning it in the fire to make it into two wicks, that's allowed. The Gemara will explain Rav Yudah soon. So the Gemara man Tana de Pchises Neir Manahu. Who's the Tana that says that when you form a keli, you take a piece of clay and you stick your fist inside of it and you form it with your fist, and even that itself is making it a keli. Right? So as Rashi says, the point there is when you make a keli, so first you have to form it with your fist, but then afterwards you usually put it into a furnace of fire to strengthen it, that it should actually be a real keli that could be used. But the Tana of our Mishnah is saying that even before you put it into a furnace, just by forming it with your fist, that's already making a keli, and it's not allowed on Yantif. Who's this Tana? Rav Yosef, Rav Meiri. This is Rav Meir. The Tanya Rav Meir said, Kli cheres, meimisa mekabel tumah. A kli cheres, at what point is it finished, that it's a keli, that it's mekabel tumah? A piece of pottery, a piece of clay that's not as a keli is not makabel tumah. So when is it makabel tumah? Mishenigmara melachtoi. When you finish doing the work of forming it, shaping it, then it's already makabel tumah. Divrei Rab Meir. Rabbi Shua, no, it's not only by shaping it. Mishi yitzarfu bekivshan. Only when you put it in the furnace of fire and boiling hot, that's what makes it hard and strong. Only then is it a full keli. So therefore, our Mishnah that says you're not allowed to form it on Yontiv is Rab Meir's opinion. Amalei Abaye. So Abaye says about this, Mimai, how could you compare it to that case over there regarding Tumah? Maybe Rab Meir said over there that it's considered to be a keli that's makabel tumah because it's already a receptacle. You could put something inside of it. So you can, even if you can't put liquid inside of it, it's gonna dissolve it. It's not yet hard enough, but you can put other things inside of it. Over here, this little lamp is very small, and you formed it with your fist. What could you put inside of it? You can't use it for a lamp yet before you put it into the furnace. So what could you use it for? The Gemara says you could use it for something. The Kabula Pshiti, you could put coins inside of it. So therefore, it's still a keli. Eked Amri, others say that he brought a different Tana. Amr Rav Yosef, Rabbi Eliezer, Bar Tzadiki. The Tana of our Mishnah is Rabbi Eliezer Bar Tzadik. The Tana we learned in the Mishnah, El Fasin Charoniyais. These plates that are from Charoniyais. The Gemara is soon going to explain what Charoniyais means. These are plates from villagers. They would eat out of plates. They took these clay and they would flatten it out. And even before it was shaped as a receptacle for a plate, but it was like a flat piece of clay, they would eat on it. So these alfasin choraniyos that are made flat, tahayres, ba'ayol mace. So if they're inside the ayol mace, it's not makabel tumah from the mace because it's not yet a keli. But utmeya is b'masa zav. It will become tameh from a zav that would move it. The difference, there's a bigger chumrah by a zav. A zav makes something tameh even if you moved it indirectly, even if a zav doesn't touch it. By a mace, Rashi brings the pasuk. By a mace, it says kol kli pasuach, which is mashma that the keli has to be some kind of a receptacle. So this flat piece of clay is not yet a receptacle. But for tumah zav, that's tameh even if you move it indirectly. Because these villagers eat out of it, it's already going to be tameh. Rabbi Eliezer Bar Tzaddik says, "Af tahir is b'masa zav." Since it's still a flat piece of clay, it's even going to be tahir from the zav that moves it. Lefi shalei nigmara malachtan, because the malacha is not completed. What's nigmara malachtan? When they shape it, when they shape this plate to be a receptacle. So therefore, our Mishnah that says once you shape it to be a receptacle, you're making a keli on Yantif, follows Rabbi Eliezer Bar Tzaddik's opinion. So again, Rabbi asked the same question. Dilme atkan lekom Rabbi Eliezer Bar Tzadik hasa. Maybe Rabbi Eliezer Bar Tzadik is only saying it over there that it would become tameh. Ela the chazil kabuli beimidi, because these plates could be used to put something inside of it even before it's put into a furnace to harden it. But over here, this little lamp, when you shape it, what is it fit for? And for the Gemara lekabuli bei pshiti, it's fit to putting inside coins in it. On Yantif, you're not allowed to shape the clay into a lamp, and you're also not allowed to shape and make these clay into flat clay that you can put food on it. B'Yontif, you're not allowed to do this on Yontif. Rab Shimon ben Gamliel mater bil fasen charaniyos. Rab Shimon ben Gamliel allows to take this clay and make it into flat surfaces, and the reason is because according to Rab Shimon ben Gamliel, he holds like Rabbi Eliezer but Rab Tzaddik. And until you actually shape it to be a receptacle, just flat is nothing. The Tana Kama holds like the opinion that we said before, that even once it's flat, it could already be used. The people, the villagers, they would use it. So therefore he says that it's not allowed to do even that on Yontif. So now the Gemara explains, my charaniyos. What does the word charaniyos mean? Amar Rav Yehuda, eiraniyos. It means eiraniyos. What my eiraniyos? Amar Abaye, tsoy chakleaisa. The plates of the people that are living in the villages. And they were not particular how they ate their food, and they would eat even out of these flat pieces of clay, even before it's shaped into a plate. The next thing it said in the Mishnah was, you can't make charcoal. So to Gemara, pshite, this should be obvious that you're not allowed to make charcoal on Yontif. Lemai chazi, what are you going to use it for? So the pshat in the Gemara's question is, as I mentioned, in the times of the Gemara, they did not use charcoal for cooking. They used charcoal for a goldsmith, a silversmith. So the Gemara is saying, we know that the heter of doing malacha on Yontif is only for eichel nefesh. So lemai chazi, making charcoal, how could this be useful for eichel nefesh? So why would this be allowed? Obviously, it shouldn't be allowed. After the Gemara, he's making this charcoal to give to the people that are the bathhouse. They take care of the bathhouses, and it's going to be used for the bathhouse on that day to heat it up on that day. So maybe you would think that this is something that you have a na of on Yontif itself, and maybe this should be allowed. But are you allowed to heat up a bathhouse and take a bath on Yontif? This is one of the gzeiros of Chazal is that you're not allowed to take a bath on Yontif, and actually even if you heat up the water from before Yontif, you're not allowed. So what's the Gemara answering? That I would think that this is being used for the bathhouse. It's anyways not allowed. So the Gemara answers, taking a bath on Yontif, yes, there's a takana that's not allowed. But to heat up an oven in a bathhouse, lahazia, and then it's used like a sauna, like a schwitzbad. So maybe I would think that that's allowed. V'kaidim gzeiret. This is before they made a gzeiret. There were different stages when they made this gzeiret. We learned this in the Gemara and Shabbos. So before they made the gzeiret, that this is not allowed. So alchanami lahazia v'kaidim gzeiret. So over here, if you're making this charcoal for the sauna, and before the gzeiret, that you're not allowed to go into a sauna on Yontif, I would think maybe that it's allowed for that. You're having a na of it on Yontif. So therefore, that's the chiddush of our Mishnah, that even though you're having a na of it, but since you're forming a keli, it's not allowed. The next thing it said in the Mishnah was, you can't cut a wick into two. And our Mishnah did not say shnayim, but in the Mishnah it says shnayim. You can't cut a wick into two. And then what did Rabbi Yehuda say? In fire, you're allowed to cut it into two. With a knife, you're not allowed to cut it into two, because you're making a keli, you're taking one and making it into two. So ba'or nami, so even if you're doing it with fire and you're cutting it with fire into two, nami kamasaken mona. It's the same thing. You're taking one wick and making it into two. So why does Rabbi Yehuda allow it? Tani Rab Chiya, chaytcha ba'or, when it's cut in fire, how is this done? Befi shtei neiris. When you put this one long wick into two lamps, you have two lamps on two sides, and you put this wick into two lamps with oil, and then in the middle you have that wick right over there that's connected on both sides, and then you light the fire for the wick right in the middle. What happens when you light the fire of the wick in the middle? So now it's going to divide the wick into two, and you're going to have the wick burning on both lamps. So therefore, in such a case, Rabbi Yehuda allows it because it doesn't look like you're making a keli. You're not cutting it into two by lighting it on fire. You're just lighting it, and automatically you have two wicks that are burning in two kelim. That's how Rabbi Yehuda allows it. Amar Rab Nosson bar Abba, Amar Rav said, "Meichatin es apsila b'yomtiv." You're allowed to meichatin. You're allowed to trim the psila. My meichatin. What does this mean to trim the wick? Amar Rav Chanina bar Shalmiya b'shmei derav la duye chushcha. To remove the, when you have sometimes at the tip of a wick, the blackness and like sort of charcoal that's there a little bit. At the tip of a wick, you're allowed to take that off on Yontif to make the light lighter. Tani bar Kapara, we learned bar Kapara said in the Beitza, Vav dvarim nemru b'psila, there were 6 halachas said regarding wicks. on Yantiv. Gimel lahachmer, 3 are stringent, and the Gimel lahakol, and 3 are to be lenient. Lahachmer, the 3 that are stringent, ein goydlin oisa lachatchila b'Yantiv. You can't spin the wicks, you can't lachatchila take the wicks to spin them on Yantiv. Ve'ein mahavivin oisa ba'or, you're not allowed to singe the wick on Yantiv to make it easier to light. Ve'ein chaytchen oisa l'shnayim, and you can't cut it into 2. All of these is because you're making it into a keli, you're making it into a proper wick that could be used. Lahakol, then there were 3 that were said as leniencies. Memacha biyad, if the wick is not thin enough, you can kvetch it down, or sort of with your hands, you can squeeze it. So that's allowed. V'shoira b'shemen, and also in order for it to burn better, you're allowed to soak it in oil. And v'chaytcha b'or b'fi shtei neres. And like Rabbi Yehuda said before, if you have a long wick that's already in 2 lamps, you can cut it in the middle. How? By lighting it on fire. The Gemara now brings another statement of the same Amayra that was mentioned before, even though it's a completely unrelated subject. And here we have a piece of Agadata. So v'amarav nasim barabe amarav asirei Bavel, the rich people of Bavel, yerdei gehenim heim. They're going to go into Gehenim. Why? So the Gemara brings an incident that happened. They didn't give tzedakah basically. Kiha, the Shapsoi bar Marinus, this fellow, Shapsoi bar Marinus, ikla Bavel, he made his way to Bavel. Baya minayu iske, he asked of them to give him merchandise so he could make some parnasa, and he'll keep half of the profit for himself. V'lo they didn't give him. Mizayne, he asked them to give him food. Mezaname lo zainu, and they didn't feed him food either. So Shapsoi Bamarinus said, Hani me'edav Rav kastu. These individuals here in Bavel, they come from the Eid of Rav. Because the pasuk says, "V'nasan l'cha rachamim v'rechamecha." The Eibishter gives you mercy and you have mercy, which means kol hameracham al habriyos. Anybody that has mercy on people, b'yidua shu mizareh shel Avraham Avinu. We know that he is a descendant from Avraham Avinu. V'chol mishe'ein meracham al habriyos, a person that has no rachmanis on people, b'yidua she'einai mizareh shel Avraham Avinu. So it's known that he doesn't come from Avraham Avinu. V'amarav nasan ba'amarav kol mitzapal shulchan acherim. Someone that hopes or looks out for food from other people's tables, he doesn't have what to eat for himself. Oilam choshach badai. His entire world, everything is dark for him. Everything he sees is dark. Shenema, the pasuk says, Neidadu lechem, a person that wanders and looks for bread. Aye, where's their bread? Yedak hinochem biyadai, and he doesn't have. Aye, yodak hinochem biyadai, yoim choshach, yoim choshech. So the day is dark for him. He doesn't have any light in his life. His whole life is not a life. Tanarabanan, Abraisa, we learned Gimel. There are 3 individuals. Their life is not a life. Person that has to hope and wait for food by his friend's table. Someone that his wife controls him. And someone that he has pain that is in his body, is pain. And the Yeshayimrim and others add and say, also someone that only has one shirt to wear, one set of clothing to wear. Rashi says you have one set of clothing to wear, you never get a chance to wash it. And eventually you develop lice and you have terrible irritation from it. And the Gemara explains, Tanakama, the Tanakama that doesn't count this individual that only has one garment, that he doesn't include that in the 3 that don't have life. Because even if he can't wash it, but if he's careful with his clothing, he can inspect it and make sure that he shouldn't get lice, and therefore he won't get irritated.